All right, hi everyone. So welcome to the tutorial for Varieties of Human-like AI. So in addition to Ida, who we all heard from this morning, the tutorial is also going to be led by Arthur Juliani, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research.
Hi everyone, good morning. So yeah, today I'm going to be leading a tutorial on, based on some of the stuff Ida was talking about in the keynote a bit earlier, varieties of human-like AI. In particular, we're going to be using this library that we worked on together called Neuronav, which enables running all sorts of RL simulations in various kinds of environments. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing today in the tutorial, so we'll start with setting some expectations, what some of the learning outcomes are going to be. Then we'll jump into a... OK. I'll talk closer to the mic. Everyone can hear me now? No, it's fine. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah? Good. OK, great. Yeah, so we're interested, in making this something that's as valuable as possible to as many people here. So we have a couple of surveys, one at the beginning, one at the end, to get a sense of what you're hoping to get out of this, what your research background is, experience with things like RL. And then at the end, if you find any bugs or have any interesting feedback, we have a form, because we'd love to know what your research use cases are and how Neuronav may or may not be helpful for those use cases. I'll walk through the repo. So it's a public open source repo. It's been online for a few months now, so it's been in development a bit. I'll show you kind of what the components of Neuronav are, how it currently exists. Then the bulk of the time will be spent walking through this interactive notebook. And so you'll either be installing Neuronav on your own machine. If you have some experience with Python and installing packages, you can do that relatively easily. If you are newer to using these kinds of tools, we also have a Google Colab version of all the notebooks, including the tutorial notebook. So you'll be able to very easily follow along in Google Colab as well. And that'll be the bulk of this conducting RL experiment or RL simulation section. Then once we walk through the notebook, this should give you enough information and knowledge of both the library as well as the algorithms and kind of tasks that you can define with Neuronav. And we'll have time towards the end for creating your own experiments. And I'm very curious to see how people can use these different tools to pose novel questions and maybe even come up with some novel findings in the time of the tutorial. And then at the end, like I said, we'll have another survey, and I'd love to get everyone's feedback on how things go. OK, so for some high-level expectations, we're going to be kind of starting with the very basics of reinforcement learning and then working our way up to more complicated, more human-like models. As I said, this is also kind of an introduction to this Neuronav library. So hopefully, you'll be able to be quite proficient at using the library by the end of the tutorial. You'll be learning about a number of these RL algorithms to study human and other animal decision-making. There are a number of nice tools that are part of the library for easily visualizing some of the things like the learn policies, the learn value functions, which I think are one of the kind of like key components to getting greater insight into what these models and algorithms are actually doing, aside from just giving you some kind of score out at the end. And then, of course, ultimately, being able to use this toolkit for something like your own research is the most important outcome possible. Great. So before we begin, I'd like to just kind of understand some background in the room, right? So who has experience with reinforcement learning generally? Raise your hand. Cool. So yeah, maybe half of the people. What about reinforcement learning in Python in particular? Raise of hands. A little bit fewer. Is the rest of the people reinforcement learning in MATLAB, something like that? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Great. And so there are other, OK, so for people who have done RL, what about like who's done exclusively maybe model-free reinforcement learning? Who's done successor representation learning? Okay, fewer hands here. We're going to definitely go over some successor models. What about model-based kinds of methods in planning? Yeah, okay. So among RL experience, there's kind of a diversity. And we'll be looking at this kind of diverse set of models, and you can instantiate a lot of these kinds of models in NeuroNav. So also, there are some kind of like more detailed questions that you can't answer with raising your hand or not with this binary signal. But we'd love to know what the people's research backgrounds are who are here, and what you're maybe hoping to get out of this tutorial, so that we can compare that at the end to what you might actually have gotten out. So as you can see, there's a QR code right here. There's also the survey link. The QR code takes you to that kind of long survey if you don't want to have to type in all those characters. Yeah, so before we start, I'll maybe just pause a minute or so and let people fill that out who want to before we move on to the next stage. I see people pointing their cameras at it. It is working, right? Just to confirm. Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay, so I think maybe people have had enough time to at least say what your research background is, or at least have the forum open, which is important. Great, so I can move on to kind of introducing NeuroNav. So we've been touched at it, I guess, indirectly, but it's this open source library we've been working on for doing this kind of reproducible work around RL and cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. And it is composed of these kind of three main components. So we have these set of standardized environments, which are these OpenAI gym style environments, so they can interact with kind of typical RL algorithms that often people code up on and put on GitHub that work with gyms. So we have some examples of these at the top here, where the top ones are these grid-like environments, which I'll go into more detail. And then the bottom row are these graph-style environments. So these kind of capture two classes of these multi-step decision-making tasks that are often used in the literature. We then have a set of these kind of canonical tabular reinforcement learning algorithms, which I'll go into in more depth shortly. And then the third component are these set of Jupyter notebooks that you can either run locally on your machine or in Google Colab, each of which either introduce some relevant aspect to reinforcement learning or reproduce some subset of results from relevant papers in the literature. So these are all things that are kind of expanding over time. So what you're seeing now is kind of the current snapshot of NeuroNav, but our intention is to add to each of these three components over time. And because it's open source, if anyone is interested in contributing their own task, environment, relevant algorithm, or notebook replicating useful results to the field, we'd love to chat and see about incorporating that into the library as well. Okay, so now the really relevant thing, which is where actually does this project live? So this is the link to it. We have here a nice QR code to pull it up. And like I said, we have these two kinds of interactive options. Yes? Mm-hmm.
On the CCN website.
Yes, it's also on the CCN website. Yeah, so there's multiple ways to get to this. And like I said, we have these two ways that you can follow along during the tutorial. You can either use the Colab notebooks, or you can install it locally on your machine if you're comfortable with doing a git clone and a pip install. So we'll wait a few minutes and let people pick one of these two options. I'll kind of briefly show you what each of those are going to look like. But first, just a show of hands, I'm curious who wants to, or who thinks they'll try to actually install the library locally? Nice, yeah, some Python experts here. And who wants to follow along on a collab? Okay, great. Fantastic option as well. Yeah, so because the advanced will take a little bit longer, yeah, we'll pause here for a bit while people figure that out. And I'll use this time to walk a bit through the GitHub repository and show you what is contained in NeuroNav. Okay, so this is the landing page. And like I said, we have a list of requirements here. This is the relevant section for people who want to locally install. So it's relatively simple. You'll just clone or download the repo. And then from the root of the repository, you can do this pip install command. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and of course, yep. Yes. Yes, definitely. So I'll walk through, yeah, I guess I'll jump to that first, since it's perhaps the most relevant. So we have these three sections, like I said, the environments, the algorithms, and the notebooks. You can click this notebook section, and you get this list of the current set of notebooks. The one that's most relevant here, as you might expect, is the CCN 2022 tutorial. This link here on the left will take you to the local version of the notebook. And the link here on the right under Colab link will take you to the Colab version. So if you click this Colab link, it'll take you to this page, which I already have pulled up. And you may or may not need to have a Google account to launch Colab. But no, okay. But yeah, it's relatively straightforward to use. I'm actually curious, again, show of hands, who here has used Google Colab before to run stuff? Okay, amazing, yeah. Yeah, so as you can tell here, kind of the key component to getting this to work on Colab is to uncomment these two lines, which will allow it to install the package on the Colab VM and run it that way. Okay, internet's a little slow. Oh, really? Yeah, I'd like to think that GitHub's more robust than like 100 people all accessing the same site at the same time. Sorry, can you say that a bit louder?
So we have the two different runtimes, right? GPU and CPU.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe too many people are using the same runtime at the moment. So if some people maybe switch to the CPU or TPU or whatever is available, then it might work together.
The collab should be local. When you download a collab, it should show local, it should be shared.
Oh, so
Yeah, yeah, every collab should be its own like cloud VM. So I don't think it.
The collab is exactly like running it on your machine. It's just you're not actually installing anything locally.
Is it the collab that's malfunctioning or GitHub?
It looks like GitHub. It was
I see.
GitHub.
Okay, so the collab still works. Collab is yeah, it's the GitHub. Google versus oh, the internet is slow.
Yeah.
Then try collab and then maybe the download the background. So if everyone tries collab, we can't access right now, and some people can download and some people can download twice.
Yeah, the library isn't huge, but I guess it might be the case that just running it in the collab would be have the like smaller relative load on the internet here.
The internet here is slow too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh wow, okay. It's very slow.
Yeah, yeah.
I see. So it's a local internet issue. I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, that's good.
so apparently hotspotting phones can download.
Yeah, okay, so if people want to hotspot phones, that is an alternate option. At the very least, I have a local copy of this tutorial, so I'll be able to walk through and show everyone everything. And then hopefully people, yeah, will be able to follow along on Colab as well as possible, or use their own hotspots and download the package as well. Okay, so while we're still waiting on the internet, for various people, we'll let people take a little bit more time to get these things set up, and I'll walk a bit more through the repo as well. So as I mentioned, the first kind of component of Neuronab is the set of environments, and we have these two broad classes of environment types, these 2D maze-like environments, which we refer to as the GridEnv class. And as I'll show, there's a number of possible kind of configurations of both the transition structure of the environment and the reward function structure. So we have a number of different kinds of environment types. We reference some of the papers that are relevant here. I think some of these probably have additional references that go further back. So if someone is like, oh, I know the paper that this maze type was used for, please let us know. We'd love to add it to the repository. We also support a number of different observation types. So this is kind of very important to different kinds of research. Here we'll just be using this kind of index or one-hot style observation type where every state is treated totally independently, but we have support for a number of different kinds of observation types that, for example, take into account Euclidean information about the shape of the environment or wall boundaries, various things like that. Yes, so it's also possible to extend the observation type API relatively straightforwardly. So for example, if you have in mind a particular kinds of observation that you want to use within the context of one of these grid-like tasks, it's relatively straightforward to do that. And if that's something you want to do at the end of the tutorial, I'd love to like sit down and show anyone how to do that. So then the other major class of environments are these graph-like environments, where you have a series of states that are nodes and they're connected by edges. And here again, you can define various kinds of observation types, including images, which I think are particularly relevant. It's often the case, right, that in fMRI studies, you might have some like underlying graph structure, and what you show people are actually images that correspond to walking along the graph, something like that. Then the third and final component here to round out the markdown files in the repo is this, the algorithm section. And we have here a set of these kind of relatively canonical tabular reinforcement learning algorithms that cover simple one-step temporal difference learning, Dyna-style algorithm, successor algorithm, model-based, eligibility trace, etc. And here, for those people who are maybe a little more new to reinforcement learning, we have a list of some of the common parameters between, or the common hyperparameters between these models, and what some of the typical values are if you're looking for like a starting range to begin exploring. Okay, so now show of hands, who has gotten it installed or gotten the Colab set up and is ready to kind of start following along? Okay, great. That's at least half. So I think, like, given the constraints of the internet here, that sounds pretty good to me.
Can I just?
Yeah.
If anyone needs help, I can come and help you. Just raise your hand. I'll be monitoring to assist.
Okay. Yeah, and if anyone also has a question, like as some people have already been doing, like feel free to just raise your hand and I can try to answer as well. Okay, so I've already kind of pointed people to the CCN tutorial page, and people kind of know how to grab the local or the Colab notebook. This here is kind of the table of contents of the 7 different sections of that notebook that we'll walk through. Okay, so can people read this? Would anyone like me to make the font a little bigger, maybe? Yes, okay, some nodding heads. Yeah, so I'll try following along with the Colab version, and then I'll switch to the local if something ends up not working out. So here, like I said, on Colab, the first thing we can do is install the package into the VM. Great, and once that's done, we can import all of our dependencies. Fantastic. Okay, so I said that we were going to start at the beginning, and I was really meaning that. We're started at the basics of reinforcement learning, right? So the most basic thing about reinforcement learning is that you have these 2 entities, and they interact in a dynamic way between one another. You have an agent, and you have an environment. The environment provides states and rewards to the agent, and the agent takes actions in the environment that update the state of the environment, right? And we can instantiate this in the context of a very simple grid world. So this is kind of like the first bit of NeuroNav code that you can interact with. So we can define this grid environment, and we can say that we want the micro size of the environment, which is the really tiny one. We can then reset the environment, and then we can render it out. And what we get out is this little view where we have this green block, a white block, and a bunch of gray blocks. And so just for interpretation, the white block is the position of the agent, the green block is the goal position or the reward position. The gray blocks are parts of the environment that the agent cannot move towards, and the black blocks are the open space that it can. So the kind of very simple mental model here to use, right, is that the white block is this rat in a maze, the green block is some sort of rewarding stimuli like food that it likes, and then its action space here is the ability to move in one of 4 directions, the cardinal directions.
Does anyone need hotspots to download to? I can bring it. Does anyone need hotspots to download it? If anyone still doesn't have access, let me know. Raise your hand. I'll come to you. Okay, 1 person there, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I will come to you shortly. If I can't find you, please raise your hand again.
Yeah, and just as a little note, so I mentioned this micro size. There's also 2 other type sizes. So you can instantiate a small size, which is an 11 by 11, or a large size, which is a 17 by 17. But here, for this first example, we'll be using a very simple one because we're going to be solving this with a very simple algorithm that involves a little bit of human cognition as well. Okay, so now we're able to instantiate an environment and we have some entities in it and we know what those entities are. Fantastic. The next question is, well, how do we actually interact with the environment? And so because we're using the standard OpenAI Gym interface, the kind of main two functions that we interact with here are, first of all, this reset function, which resets the state of the environment. And then we have this environment.step function, which steps the environment. And so here we have 4 possible actions, 0, 1, 2, 3, which correspond to the 4 cardinal directions the agent can move within. So we pass the action we'd like to take, and typical with the OpenAI Gym setup, we get back an observation, a reward, flag telling us if the environment is in a done state, if the episode's completed, and then some miscellaneous information that we can ignore here. So we can take a step in our environment, and we see that now our agent has moved up 1 step. And as I alluded to, we can take multiple steps in the environment. So here we have an optimal action sequence that I've predefined using my knowledge of the task. And we can then instantiate a nice little for loop and take this sequence of actions, and in doing so, step, 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 until our agent reaches the state that had the reward, and we can print out at every time step the information that's relevant here. And what we find is that this final action gives the reward of +1. So this is great. Our agent reached the reward. But of course, our agent hasn't learned anything. We used our human knowledge to solve this task. So the goal of reinforcement learning is, of course, to provide a number of algorithms or figure out ways that these agents can, of course, learn to solve this task themselves. So for each of these sections, there's a little bonus questions thing that we have to inspire people to maybe think a little bit more deeply. Here, it's not so complicated, which is to say, okay, so we have this algorithm that we used. What are maybe some other interesting algorithms that you might want to use? So stepping back even further now, I showed you a multi-step maze task. We're going to look at model-free value learning in a very simple task, a bandit task. And in this case, the bandit comes from this idea of casino, gambling at slot machines. You have multiple possible slot machines or bandits you might pick. And you have multiple arms, arm corresponding to each action, right? And so there are basically no states in this scenario, or there's only a single state. And what we really want to learn are the action values. What is the value of taking each action? So this is an extremely simple example. We are in this start state. There are 3 possible actions, actions 0, 1, and 2, and they give 3 different rewards deterministically. So we're not even in like a probabilistic setting here. And action 0, as you can see, is the most rewarding. So we want to be able to start by learning what is the action that's the most rewarding, simple as possible, right? So we can do this by instantiating one of these graph environments that correspond to this task. So here we have a built-in task called the 3-arm bandit, which corresponds to the structure right here. We can render it out. And we get this rendering where each of these nodes is a state, right? And the edges are actions. So we have these 3 actions. And then the color of the nodes corresponds to the reward. And we can actually start a bit with a super simple Q-learning algorithm here, where all we're trying to learn are what the values are that correspond to each of these actions, which correspond to the values of this action value Q function. And this Q function is basically a lookup table, and we can instantiate it as this matrix that corresponds to number of actions by number of states, right? And in this case, there's only 1 state, so we have this really simple vector that we're learning. And as I mentioned, NeuroNav has a number of these algorithms built in. So we can instantiate our Q-learning algorithm here by calling this function TDQ. So we're doing temporal difference Q-learning here. In this case, there's not so much Can you, okay, yeah, it's back. Yes, so to instantiate this agent, we have to pass it two important pieces.
Yeah, I see that. Trade Joe.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Okay. Everyone, yeah, hear me well? Fantastic. Great. So to instantiate these agents, you have to pass them at least two pieces of information, the two essential pieces of information being the size of the state space and the size of the action space. So we can get those out automatically from the environment. So we have these two variables here, the state size of the environment and the number of actions in the action space. So with that, we can instantiate.
Mike is dead.
We can instantiate.
He was literally. Oh, hi. Mike died.
I don't know. Okay. At least right now I don't hear anything, so I'll move on. Okay, so we have this agent. It has a Q function. We can get out the Q function by calling the agent.q. And in this case, we instantiate it with all zeros, and we have three actions, one state, so it's a simple vector of three zeros. Very straightforward. Right, and then we can start to update these Q values, learning using a simple update rule, where we take some action in the environment, we observe a reward, and then we update the value information for that action based on the reward, based on the difference between the perceived reward and the expected action value. And that's what's kind of corresponding to the equation here, with the alpha being the learning rate that we use, and the R being the reward. So by default, the algorithm is set to a learning rate of 0.1, but we can change that. Just to show how you do that, when you instantiate the agent, you can pass this argument LR, corresponding to the learning rate, and you can set it to whatever you'd like. So here, we'll set it, just for consistency, to 0.1. Yes? So, I see. No, there's not an agent.reset, so you'd have to reinstantiate the agent, yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, so the question was if there's a similar function to the environment.reset for the agent. And the answer is that if you want to, for example, reset the Q function back to a table of zeros in this case, you'd have to reinstantiate the Q function. There is actually a .reset call that you can make on the agent, but that's reserved for other things like resetting eligibility traces, for example, that might be part of like the actual dynamics of the algorithm. Okay, so we have an environment that we want to try solving. Very, very simple. We have a agent that can learn these Q values. So the code that we have here is basically for a number of trials of this multi-arm bandit to reset the environment, randomly sample an action, and then take that action in the environment, to log the Q value, because as you can see down here, we're going to be looking at how these Q values change, and then to call the agent.update function, right? And so this, yes? Yes, that's a great question. So for this example, we aren't going to be using the Q values to inform how we sample actions. So we're sampling actions totally uniformly, which is obviously the most naive thing you can do. So the very next example I'll show is actually using the Q function to more intelligently sample the actions. Yeah. But this, I guess, shows off one of the nice aspects of the API here, which is that given that we know what the action space of the environment is, or the environment knows its own action space, you can sample actions from that environment. And yeah, so we do this for 200 steps. We call this update function, which instantiates this Q update, this temporal difference update learning rule right here. And then we can compare the Q values for each of these 3 actions during the course of the learning process with this learning rate of 0.1. And what we see is what we'd of course expect to see, but it's always nice to see, which is that relative to the actual value of these 3 actions, the Q function asymptotically goes towards those 3 values. Yes? Yes, so when you instantiate the agent, you pass this LR parameter, and you can set it, yeah, to whatever you'd like. Yeah, so I guess as a nice little exercise, we could, for example, make it much smaller here. And we can replot this, and we find okay, yeah, let's jump up one more. Yes, there we go. Okay, and so now with the order of magnitude smaller learning rate, we find that after these 200 steps, it still hasn't converged to the optimal action value functions. So that's something that you can play with.
Mine isn't learning. It's just got a flat line.
Maybe Ida can help you. Yeah, that may be the case. So if you've run any of these cells, for this, you'd want to go back up to the cell here where we instantiate the environment and make sure you kind of do that from scratch. Yes?
It might be worth just when you're using the Varieties to copy that agent line onto the beginning of that cell line so that that whole cell is then.
Yeah.
Can you say that loud for others?
Yeah, so if, for example, you'd like all of this to run in one cell, you can copy and paste the code such that these 3 cells are all part of one cell so that every time you rerun it, the state of things is consistent. Okay, so obviously what we've learned are some optimal Q values, and that's great. But we want to be able to actually do this in a way where we're not just taking random actions, where we're kind of intelligently sampling actions, and where the agent itself is in some kind of way having an actual policy that it's using. So this is, core to this is the idea of the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And built into NeuroNav, we have 2 simple algorithms for attempting to resolve this issue, right? So these 2 are this kind of softmax-based sampling approach and epsilon greedy sampling. So each is relatively straightforward, right? So in the case of the softmax sampling, we basically just have the agent sample actions based on its current estimate of the Q values for those actions. So if an action has a large Q value relative to the other actions, that action will be selected proportionally more frequently. Then in the case of epsilon greedy, you have kind of like a harder version of this, or yeah, like a less smooth version of this approach, where you have some epsilon parameter and you take a random action with a random probability of that epsilon parameter, or you take the maximally estimated Q value otherwise, right? So it's this trade-off between random actions versus max in epsilon greedy, whereas in the softmax style, you're smoothly trading off based on the current estimated action values. So now we'll introduce a couple more parameters that we pass to the agent here. So there's this pol type, which corresponds to the policy type. You can either pass softmax or e greedy. It's relatively, just as a side note, people who maybe have other kinds of sampling methods in mind, it's relatively easy to extend the API. So if you want to add your own, you're free to do that. And then in the case of the softmax style algorithm, there's additional parameter called beta, which determines how sharp or smooth the softmax function is. So now again, we can run a similar bit of code, except here, instead of sampling from the environment randomly, we can have the agent sample an action based on the current state.
Question. Where do you
Yes.
set the random seed?
Where do you set the random seed? That's a good question. So right now, the agent, I do not believe has a random seed function, but that would be a great addition. I mean, I think because this is using NumPy under the code, the most straightforward way would be to set the NumPy seed, and then that would determine things in a reproducible way.
Yeah. It was more of a suggestion. Add a random seed.
Yeah, no, that is a really great suggestion. Mhm. I think, yeah, there's interesting questions then about like how you'd make sure both the environment and the agent are governed by that random seed, or whether you'd want those two things to vary independently. But regardless, yeah, it's a good idea for an addition. Okay, so here we plot two things. One is the change in probability over time for these three sets of actions, and then the other is the reward obtained based on each of the trials. So what we can see is that the probability of selecting action 0, which we know is the rewarding one, goes up over time, or is the most rewarding one, and that's reflected in the actual action selected, where after about maybe certainly after trial 50, it's consistently picking the action that corresponds to the optimal Q value. Great, and so some other things you might want to try on your own is this. I showed here how to use the softmax. You can explore the epsilon greedy version of the policy, and a few other things. Okay, so we started with this very simple bandit problem. We're now working our way back up to multi-step decision-making tasks. So here we add a little bit more complexity to this temporal difference update. So now, because we're in a setting where there's not just a single action being taken, but a sequence of actions, and we need to do proper credit assignment for the sequence of actions, we can use a modification of this update that takes into account not only the current reward, but the discounted predicted future value of the successor state that the agent ended up in. And here we use this Qmax. So what this corresponds to is some discount factor of the action value of the successor state. And the action value that we use is that we assume that the agent is going to act optimally based on its current understanding of the environment. So we use the Q value that corresponds to the highest action value available. And because there's this gamma now, we have another hyperparameter which determines how much we weigh estimated future values relative to near-term values. And this is just a diagram showing this. It's more or less similar to the other one, except now we take into account information about the future state, and the actual Q values that we get out are conditioned on a given state. And we can look at this in a little bit more complex version of the task here, where instead of having a single action that gets taken that leads to some reward, the agent has to take a sequence of actions. They're simple actions, binary actions, but it's a little bit more complicated because there has to be temporal credit assignment that takes place. So we instantiate this as this two-step task, And this is another one of these pre-built tasks. So we can just call graph structure equals graph structure.toStep. And if you're interested in exploring some of the other graph structures, there's the nice autocomplete here that'll populate a list of the available ones. Yes?
Do you know there's a mechanism for changing graph structure or changing environments over time?
Yes, so the question is there a mechanism for changing the graph structure or the environment over time? And the answer is yes. So I will, a little bit further down, show some of how to do that. Yeah, in particular, I'll show an example of changing the reward function, but it's straightforward also to change the graph structure or the blocks in the maze, right, to change the transition dynamics over time as well. Yeah. Yes? Yes. So for example, the learning rate, if you'd want to change that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. So when we were instantiating the agent, we can pass the learning rate parameter. But once the agent is created, we can also call agent.learningRate and set that to something new as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have more or less the same code, except now we're in a multi-step case. So it's a little bit more complicated where we keep taking actions until we receive this done flag, which means that we've reached one of the terminal states. And we loop over this for some number of episodes. So here we're taking steps for, we're doing 100 of these episodes. And we can run this, and we see that the agent receives not necessarily the optimal reward over time until, of course, it eventually does, right? So with seeing that this temporal difference Q learning works in this simple two-step task and reaches the optimal reward here with this hyperparameters that we've set, we can then move on finally to the more complicated version of the task. Back to this original little maze environment that we set up. And so here what we're plotting is not the reward, but the steps to the goal, right? So on trials where the steps are maxed out at 25, this means that the agent never reaches the goal. For all other step values, it means the agent reached it at some point. And here at the bottom, this corresponds to the agent reaching it in the optimal number of steps. So we see over time as the agent moves around the environment, it eventually learns to solve the task in more and more optimal way using this softmax policy for action sampling. And now, once we've learned optimal policy, an interesting question might be, well, what do the Q values actually correspond to then for this environment? So one thing we can do is we can take this Q of the agent, which are the state action values, and we can average them over actions. And then we can reshape this resulting vector into the shape of the original environment and plot these values. And what this does is it gives us a little bit of insight into what these Q values are corresponding to. So this is, you can kind of see, right, the agent starts here, it ends here, and it has a nice little gradient of value leading from the start position to the reward position. In NeuroNav, we also have this nice little function which plots this a little bit more clearly to see. So here you can use this plot values and policies function, and if you pass it an agent, and if you pass it one of these maze environments, and you give it the starting position you'd like to use for the agent, you get out this plot, which corresponds, of course, to the maze environment. And what we see here is the value gradient as well. But we also can plot out what the maximum actions are for each of the Q values. So for the set of Q values in a given state, we can take the max Q value and then plot that given action, right? So what this tells us is a little bit more insightfully what the trajectory is that the agent has actually learned to take care, which, as you can see, follows the value gradient as you might expect, and leads nicely to the reward.
Is it clear to everyone or is it fluffy? If it's unclear, please raise your hand or something.
Joe can't hear you.
Oh, she asked if it was clear what this plot means. Yeah, and of course, you're welcome to raise your hand if you have questions. Great. So up until this point, we've been, oh yes, there's some bonus questions you can think about, right? So we've introduced this new discount factor gamma. I invite you to play with the gamma value and see how that might change the learning process here. For example, what kind of path the agent might take, or what the value map might look like. Okay, so far we've been dealing with learning this Q function, which is essentially just a lookup table of state action values. And the thing about this is this is basically caching the values, and it corresponds to kind of like a static view of the environment. But of course, in the real world, where humans and animals are, environment is changing in all sorts of meaningful ways, right? So reward contingencies are changing. The transition dynamics of the environment are changing. There are other agents moving around, all sorts of things, right? And so it's pretty clear that if all you were doing are caching Q values, you maybe would be so successful at navigating the real world. So the next set of algorithms we're going to look at are various kind of more advanced methods to deal with some of the more real-world complexity that exists. The first of which being the successor representation algorithm. And so up until this point, we've been talking about the Q function, which basically kind of combines these two different things, right? It combines both reward information and it combines information about the given transition dynamics of the current state of the environment into a single set of cached values. The insight behind the successor representation is that these things can actually be decomposed into two separate, kind of like logically distinguishable functions. One being a reward function, which tells us, okay, well, what states in the environment are actually rewarding and not? And the other being this successor function, or the successor matrix, which tells us this information of what are the dynamics of movement through the environment. In a given state and a given policy, what are the kinds of future states that the agent might expect to reach? The thing about these two functions is that when they're properly formed, they can then be combined to recover this Q function that we've been using up until this point, with the special property now, of course, that we have more flexibility because instead of using a single set of values, we have these two separate things which can vary independently. And I'll kind of explore through the examples here what the implications of that is. Yes? Oh, isn't that one dead, though? Oh, no, I guess not.
Yeah, so it's just about how the success expectation is learned, because it seems like it's very similar to how value function is learned, but I was wondering how flexible it actually is, because, for instance, if for some time, for instance, from 9 to 11, like one train runs on a track, and all of a sudden it's a different train. So I would need like this very abrupt change in terms of like my success representation, but it looks like it's more of a gradual updating that would need like, I'm not sure how many iterations depending on the learning rate to sort of like represent this kind of flip of that, whether you can unpack the equation a bit and say something about how flexible it actually is, whether you can have these flips between one and the other, or whether you need this very, very gradual kind of updating that takes many iterations.
Can I take this one?
Yeah, please.
So the question is fantastic. The question is, how is the successor representation learned? You're totally right. This equation looks like the equation for model free, right? You have basically, you have a learning rate, you have the gamma, you have the prediction error, but it is a successor prediction. Wow, okay. This does not like me to go there. And also, it is the temporal difference learning uses the same thing as approach as before, but instead of updating with a reward prediction error, it is updating, or a value prediction error, it is updating with a successor prediction error. So the one hot that you see there, imagine that the successor representation for state S and action A is a row of the matrix. One hot means 0 everywhere else in that row, 1 for the location of the next state that I just got to. So I was in state 1, I took one action, and now I'm in state 3. So I will have a one hot over my, let's say, 6 states, where everything is 0, or a vector of 6, and there's a 1 in the location for state 3. That means one count. That means basically add one count to my visitations of state 3 from state 1. And that is the one hot that you see there. The learning rate that comes before means that although I'm adding that count, but my learning rate, if it's, let's say, 0.1 or 0.2, I'll need to do this 10 times or 5 times until there is no more surprises for me. Why is that a good thing? Because the environment changes a little bit sometimes, and you don't want to change everything that you've learned about the world based on small changes that sometimes happens, for instance, right? And then when you have that gamma, that is discounted expected future visitations for the next state. What does that mean? It means you go and take the row that corresponds to state 3. So we were first, in the first row of the successor representation, we were adding one count to location 3 with the learning rate. And then we go to row 3, we look at that entire row, we take a gamma for it because we're squinting a little bit, it's in the future. So it discounted all of the successors of state 3, which would be in row 3. And then we subtract from it the successor representation of this state or this row. What does that mean? If I haven't asymptoted my learning, that successor prediction error value that is after alpha, after the learning rate, it's going to be non-zero. And once I learn it, then I'm not surprised anymore. It's 0. What do I mean by that? The first time that I'm going, I'm adding a count, and then I'm looking at the successors in a discounted way. I'm subtracting, and it's non-zero. I'm surprised. Oh, I didn't expect to see all of these. My successor didn't expect all of them. If the learning rate is, say, 0.2, I will do this like 5 times or some number of times, and gradually this surprise goes to 0. I'm like, all right, I'm not surprised anymore. I'm inheriting the future of state 3 every time that from state 1, I take action A. So that's the way the successor representation is learned, the first part of your question, using the temporal difference learning method and a successor prediction error that inherits the discounted futures of the next state I just saw. So it's multi-step inheritance in that sense. Because I only visited state 3, I didn't go from S1 directly to 5 because there is no direct path. But because I inherited the future of 3, there is now a non-zero value of the successor representation between state 1 and state 5, even though I didn't add a one hot for 5 because I had added it for the S3 row. Does that make sense to everyone? Before I answer the second part of his question. Yes, David.
Okay. I think it's worth noting that just like with the Q function, that we should differentiate the Q function itself from learning the Q function. So I could tell you what the 3 Qs are in our original thing, and then you can work with that. Or we can learn the Q function through things like temporal difference learning. So the successor function could be given as I could tell you when the trains are coming, and you could then fill in the successor function because you have language and cognition and episodic memory and all these other things, or you could learn it through these kinds of mechanisms. So, I'm correct in that, right? That there's no reason that we can think of them separately. And so sometimes there might be fast transitions or fast changes that come because you're informed of the successor representation.
In other words, a rat, you can't tell it when the trains are coming, but to a human you can. So for humans, there are multiple ways of learning. I'm guessing with rats, I don't know, maybe you disagree. Okay, rats speak English, apparently. Also fair. That's why the learning rate is 0.1 instead of, yeah. So to answer your second question, you asked, what if the environment changes? So if the agent has time to go back, it will update everything. If it doesn't have time, that's when dinosaur comes in, which means you can update it via replay. What happens there is, oh, you know, I was going to 2, and then I see that instead of going to 4, I'm ending up in 5. What happened here now, right? And how do I update that if I don't have enough time to go back and update, let's say, state 0 or state 1 or something that was before? One way that can happen, another thing that David has worked on, which is sequential replay. By replaying the most recent changes you've learned and the earlier things that you know about the structure of the environment, with the same learning rule, with the same temporal difference rule, you can update your successor representation. Now, this could be that someone verbally tells you, and that still needs to happen in your mind to train the rest of it with the replay. So it still would require that even if someone tells you verbally something has changed. So I tell you, oh, train A or F are totally shut down right now. You need to, in your temporary, at least, the temporary successor representation you're using in your working memory, you would need to update that so that you don't end up in, let's say, the Bronx instead of ending up in Harlem, because that happens sometimes, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Anybody has questions?
I just want to add, you can also have multiple maps. Yes. So you could have multiple successor representations that you flip between. You say, oh, we're in condition 1, condition 2.
Not only that, you can also have multi-scale maps of the same map, but at multi-scales, which is a paper that we had with Eva Brunig in JNeuro. We tested it with virtual reality navigation, fMRI. Turns out it works. Any questions on this? Yes.
Just a clarifying question. Is this very similar to just learning a transition probability matrix, but instead of being one step, it's like n steps in the future? And then the second question is, the alpha in here, are they meant to be the same alpha used for learning both the reward function and the successor representation, or is it going to be different?
Both are excellent questions. To your first question, it is not the same because these are not probabilities of transitions. There are multi-step model-based approaches. There's just, you know, there's some work by, there's some work since even 1999 on this, I believe. But there's like newer recent work as well. So this is not the same as that. It's not just that you have like increased the steps that you're considering one-step probabilities. It's not just that. There are various reasons for this, especially in the paper with Mark Howard. We have shown that there's particular mathematical properties of successor representation that you might want to take a look. If you know linear algebra, it might actually help to say the successor representation is like the inverse of the graph Laplacian, which is something that you use when you want to cluster graphs, for instance. And that is how the successor representation has information about the structure or clusters that you have. And the larger you make your gamma, you get information about larger clusters. So in a manner of speaking, it's not just a new thing that reinforcement learning created. It goes back to the notion of in graph theory and how you cluster graphs. As a matter of fact, you know, the algorithms that Google used initially are very related, which is you want to see how often a particular page is visited from every other page. And that is, the reachability is very similar to this idea of count-based, other than instead of the rows, it's the columns. It's like how often is something sort of visited from others and what other places sort of visit this. So if you had a hub somewhere, that row will be very, very full. But if you had like a lone kind of lone node, then it would be kind of zero, the successor representation of it, both like the row and the column, if that makes sense. Your other question was about the learning rates. Excellent question. We actually tested it in my 2017 paper that we tested the dinosaur and the behavior that I showed, whether they were learning the rewards and transition structures with different learning rates. In that experiment, they weren't. But depending on your environment, it would make sense. One of the slides that I didn't get to show is if you're in a volatile environment, your learning rates should be different than if you're in a very stable environment. If the rewards are stable, your learning rate should be different than if the rewards are volatile. And if the structure is stable versus volatile, that should differ. So in New York City, where I live, the structures of the subway is very volatile, like very easily changes. So it makes sense for me to have a higher learning rate there when the structures change. But if I go somewhere where it's extremely stable, the buses come at the same time, like, I don't know, German trains or something, where I lived in Germany before, it didn't, like, if it was 5 minutes late, there was a revolt. So there was just different ways. I didn't need to update the train's kind of structures as much there as I needed to do, right? So there is a way in which, and this goes back to the question that the gentleman in the front was asking, whether it's possible for an agent to change its parameters to adapt to the changes, dynamic changes in the environment and task. Does that answer all your questions? Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Excuse me, sorry. Getting my steps in also here.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned the multiple maps with the multiple scales. What about like within the same environment in the navigation paradigm? We often have a multiple goals depending on the context. Like you go to school, you go to the bar, you go to the pub, but the environment is same. But do we need to make a different, calculate different successive representation for every single like the goal location? And how do they switch? Like in humans, we can just simply learn once.
Thank you so much. Excellent question. So you learn the rewards. So the vector of rewards is separate from the map of the environment. So if I want to change the goal, I can just, it's the equivalent of just changing the vector of rewards and saying, right now the reward is in location, that location or this one. Like it's a bar, so let's say it's 0 everywhere else, and it's 1 for the state that is the bar. Let's say state 5 is the bar. Or let's say that the library is state 6. If I want to go to the library, it's like everything else is like around 0 or lower a little bit, and the library is a little higher. So that's an easy way to not have to change the map. But I would say that successor representation is policy dependent, meaning if there is one area that you go to more often because you're visiting it more often, either because it's on your way to work, or just because you really like that bar and you go there very often, you will have a successor representation that is biased towards that direction, as opposed to a situation where you're equally likely either doing a random walk or with equal likelihood you go everywhere. So some of the successor representation maps that are biased would say, although you were trying to go to the library, maybe actually you ended up finding yourself in front of the bar because the successor representation was still skewed towards that direction because you went there often. I've done this when my friends move or something, that I end up going to their old apartment, but maybe it's just me being like a little absent-minded. But we have experiments showing that human behavior is consistent with that kind of stickiness of places that you visit often. And in fact, in some work that Arthur and I are doing on computational psychiatry, we think if you ruminate a lot about some particular outcome, you might bias your particular cognitive maps or, for instance, successor representations towards the direction of bad outcome. And so in that way, expect that to happen more when you're predicting what's going to happen in the future. So there are different ways in which your map could get biased if you go somewhere a lot. Which doesn't necessarily happen in model-based. You need to do a little more work to change the probabilities, and you'll need to update those. And replay can also change this kind of bias. So long story short, it's easy to do multiple goals. It's easy to change structures, but there is a path-dependent, policy-dependent skewedness of the representations towards directions you visit often in the successor representation, which could be related to rewards, or it could be just coincidental. Your bus always goes from this square. So you have an high expected visitation for that, in spite of the fact that it's not a rewarding state, if that makes sense. Does it answer all your questions? Okay. Anyone else before me? Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for all the wonderful, insightful questions and the fantastic answers from Ida. I hope that's clarified a lot of the theoretical aspects of the successor representation. So now I'll briefly show you what the practical implications of that are in the case of a reward revaluation task. But before we get to that, I just want to show that we can create one of these SR agents. So here we have temporal difference SR. So TDSR is the name of the class here. We can instantiate it just the same way we instantiate our Q-learning agent. And we can train it in one of these simple grid worlds. So here, once again, right, the number of steps to goal. quickly goes down to 0 by the time we've done 100 episodes. But instead of just learning at the Q function or looking at the Q function, because we have a couple of these two separate functions that we're learning here, we can visualize them separately. So first we can visualize the reward function, and what we find here is that it has learned to assign high probability or high value of reward for the state corresponding to the goal location. Makes a lot of sense. We can then also visualize some of the units or some of the columns of the successor matrix here. So I've just selected 5 random columns, and we can plot what these look like. And what you'll see is that each of these contains some information about the policy of the agent. And you'll notice that each of these is highest for the unit that actually corresponds to that unit state. So there's the number of units here, or the number of columns is the number of states, so there's one for each state. But what we find is that, as was brought up, this is a policy-dependent successor representation. So each of these successor units, as I'm calling them, is biased in the direction of the policy, which in this case means being biased in the direction of the goal location. And yeah, you're free to kind of play around with these parameters and look at what some of the other units might do as well. We can then combine these two values to get out the Q function, which looks more or less like what we'd expect. It looks more or less like what the Q function looked like in the TDQ learning case. And we can plot that a little more nicely as well. Now, there we go. Yes, so now we can look at how might the temporal difference successor representation algorithm differ in its ability to deal with changes in the environment compared to the TDQ algorithm. So here we can set up a very simple task where we have a T-maze, and we have a reward that starts in the left-hand corner of the T-maze, and then halfway through the training process, we can move the reward and move it over to the right-hand side of the maze.
Can I just add, this is exactly the example you were mentioning. Let's say that the left one is the bar and the right one is your friend's place, right? So different goals in the same environment.
Yes, and here I can introduce a bit of more of the API of NeuroNav, right? So for both the grid environment and the graph environment, there's this reward location argument that you can pass. And what this corresponds, what this is expected to be is a dictionary where we have these tuples corresponding to the state, or here it's the XY coordinate that we're interested in, and then the value of the reward we'd like here. So you can make this as arbitrarily large or complex as you want it to be. You can assign positive or negative rewards to any state in the environment. Here it's very simple. There's just a single positive reward, and we're going to start it off in the, oh, I see. So the default one is in the up left, and then here we pass for the second time the bottom right just to visualize it. Or the up left and then the up right. Yeah, and that's what each of these correspond to. So here it's kind of more explicit, 1, 1, 1, and 1, 9. Right, so what we can do is we can instantiate our two agents separately, our TDQ agent and our TDSR agent. And then we can pass them both through a training loop. And halfway through this loop, we can swap out the reward location from the left to the right. And then we can take a look at what happens, right? So as you might expect, both of the agents are able to solve the initial version of the task. So both of them find the upper left goal location and are able to optimally reach it. Then when we switch the location around, what we find is kind of interesting, which is that at first, both of them get disrupted. So both of them were expecting it in the upper left. They don't find it anymore. Now here's where the difference kind of meaningfully comes in. So because the successor matrix has been learning about the dynamics of the structure of the environment and retains that information even in the absence of the reward, once it's able to start to reach the new reward location by virtue of random exploration, it's now able to much more quickly both update the reward function and slightly modify the bias of the successor matrix towards the right-hand side. Whereas because the Q values in the TDQ algorithm are all cached, the absence of the final reward isn't enough to help the agent figure out how to get to the new reward location, because it needs instead to actually update all of these Q values independently. And we can kind of see what the implication of that is by plotting out the Q functions here. So we see that this, the TDQ agent, after all of this time, is still biased towards trying to go to the upper left, even though it's managed to kind of erase some of its Q estimates. It's not very confident that it's going to find a reward there, but it's still biased in that direction and wasn't able to modify its policy to point up here. Whereas in contrast, the SR agent in the course of these 200 episodes has been able to easily modify its policy, understands the kind of correct new reward gradient, and has a policy that goes towards it. Any questions about how this works? Yeah.
Just maybe clarify. So this will never learn because it's totally greedy, right? If it was epsilon greedy, it'll eventually find it.
Yeah, depending on the epsilon value, yeah, and depending on how many trials you give it, you could expect it to eventually, I think, converge.
That being said, if you meant the Q learning, when it's a retrospective revaluation, meaning it never goes back to the beginning to update it, it would never learn actually, even if it's epsilon greedy. And that's the case that I showed you in that study. So if it's allowed to go back versus if it's not allowed to go back from the beginning, it's a different thing. That makes sense. In the 2017 paper, you can find the results. Any other questions?
Okay, so I think we only have about 10 minutes. So we've got 2 more examples here. I'm going to do my best to go through them. Well, actually, let me pause and say, what would people like? I know we offered at the end to have some free time for people to kind of set up their own experiments, play with some of the parameters, ask questions. We can either do that right now, or I have some more examples showing the DINA algorithm and how that works and how that performs differently than Q-learning, as well as introduction to value iteration model-based algorithm, and showing how that's able to deal with transition reevaluation. Okay, so show of hands, right? So who would like to spend these last few minutes playing around with the algorithm, trying to define your own task, and Ida and I can come around and help? Who's interested in that? Okay, everyone just wants to watch me talk about things. That's great. Okay, well, actually, to compare, who wants the second option? Okay.
Oh, wow.
Fantastic. Well, Ida and I will both be available afterwards. I'm very happy and interested to hear what people think about the API, how they'd like to maybe have it changed, things they want to see added, different, anything like that. Any feedback is appreciated.
Can I ask a third thing? Who would like to, after this is over, try their own tasks and maybe talk to us? Maybe show of hands? Okay, so.
Whether you could spend maybe a minute to try to explain the organization of the toolbox, so where we find exactly what, for instance, like the agents, environment, so forth, to sort of like go from there and explore it myself, because there's probably plenty of it that we don't come around to, but that would be nice as a starting point of like how to approach it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we have a few more minutes. What I'll do is these last 2 sections, I'll go over relatively briefly. Happy to talk in more depth about how these algorithms work afterwards. And then I'll spend, the last few minutes pulling up the post-tutorial survey for people who want to fill it out. And then I can also go through the code very briefly as well for anyone who's interested. Okay, great. So far we've been dealing with kind of purely online learning, where every time the agent takes some action in the environment, it then immediately learns something from that action. We can, of course, extend this in interesting ways, one of which is to take into account past experience and keep learning from that. And that's kind of the guiding principle behind this DINA algorithm, where the agent stores the state transitions and then selectively replays them to keep learning from them, right? And the most And yeah, so the most straightforward example of this is going to be that if you're continuing to learn in an offline fashion using some replay-like algorithm, then you're going to be able to update your value estimates much more efficiently than if you're purely learning from online experience. So we can look at this in the case of this 4 rooms environment. So here we have a little bit more structure to the task. There are these bottleneck states that the agent has to pass through, so it's less trivial to find a solution than in just the open maze environment. And we have Dyna versions of Q-Learning, SR, and Actor Critic, which I don't go over here, but are part of the library. And we can instantiate this Dyna Q agent and compare it to a regular Q-Learning agent, temporal difference online Q-Learning. And we give these agents 100 steps per episode, and we let them run for 500 episodes.
Internet?
No, I think the agents, they're just doing their thing.
Is there a verbose option for people to see what the agent is doing?
No, so I mean, within the loop, you could, of course, do the environment.render, and you could look at every time step. OK, here we are. So what we find here is that given this set of relatively normal parameters, the Dyna agent learns about halfway through the training process, whereas the online TDQ agent isn't able to consistently even reach the goal, let alone reach it optimally. Now, I invite you, of course, to play with these different values. Another parameter of interest for the Dyna agents govern how frequently they're doing this sampling, right? So you can go anywhere from sampling once per time step to sampling many times a time step from its replay buffer. Great, and just to kind of illustrate the differences in value learning here, we have the value function is kind of like much more densely learned in the case of the Dyna algorithm because it's done so many more updates in the same amount of time. OK, so finally, there's the idea of model-based algorithms, right? So we started with this idea of you learn a cached set of Q values, and you kind of keep these around the whole time. We can now go to the complete opposite side, where we are dynamically computing these Q values in an iterative manner. So here, kind of similarly to the successor representation, we're learning these 2 separate things. In the case of the reward function, we're learning the same kind of thing. What is the expected reward for a given state? But now instead of learning the successor matrix, which contains information about future state dynamics given the policy, we're learning the pure transition dynamics, the one-step transition dynamics. So this matrix corresponds to, for a given state in action, what is the expected next state to enter into, right? And we can either give this to the agent automatically, or we can learn this through experience. And to kind of demonstrate how this works, we can use a task where the reward function doesn't change, but instead the transition dynamics of the environment change. So we start with this environment where it's very easy for the agent to get to the goal. It just has to walk north. And then halfway through training, we can disrupt the path of the agent by introducing this roadblock, right? And so now the agent has to learn to, instead of just walk north, do this more complicated thing, which is walk around. So we can instantiate a number of different agents here and compare them. The 4 agents that we've talked about so far in the tutorial, up to this point, temporal difference, Q, TDSR, our DynaQ, and our value iteration MBV algorithm. Right, and this one takes a little bit longer, so I'll just show it here, which is the outcome. You can feel free to kind of like run it and play with it yourself. And what we see here is that within the kind of like limited time budget of experiences, 500 experiences, what we find is that only the model-based algorithm is able to adapt its policy meaningfully. And this is because compared to these other algorithms, the model-based one is totally computing this Q value from scratch. So it's able to deal with the fact that the transition dynamics of the optimal policy have changed quite significantly by the introduction of this roadblock. But the trade-off of that is that it's much more computationally expensive because recursively computing the Q values for all of the states in the environment is much more expensive than just caching them and using them that way.
Question, is it clear why the successor representation without using replay cannot solve the transition revaluation here when structures have changed? If it's clear, please raise your hand. Oh, fewer people. If it's not clear, please raise your hand. Okay. So the reason is that the successor representation is grandfathering the past relationship when the structure hadn't changed before. And in the absence of either going back to the beginning, it can't update that multi-step relationship, or in the absence of replay. If you just add replay, like the dinosaur thing that I explained, combining successor representation and replay, then it can, in its mind, kind of replay that sequence and update those relationships. But in absence of that, it cannot. And I'm taking this to David.
Isn't it just a question of time? The dyna doesn't actually add anything beyond speed, right? I mean, if you had infinite time, wouldn't SR eventually find it?
Excellent question. They ask if it's just a matter of time. It is not if you are not allowing the agent to go back to the beginning. It will still have grandfathered for state 1, for the starting states, for particular older states. It still has grandfathered the old multi-step relationships that it had learned. That row hasn't been updated. Exactly. I love that you got this. Did everybody else get David's question and the answer? It's an important question, so I really thank you for asking that. That row, in order for it to get updated, the agent either has to go revisit that state, or it has to replay it or revisit it virtually. If it doesn't do that, that row is grandfathering the old multi-step relationships that are no longer holding, if that makes sense. Not always. So sometimes you don't have the option of going back. And so... I mean, you can virtually explore it via replay, but and also it's not exploration as in you have visited it before. You just haven't updated its multi-step relationships because you're not revisiting it again.
Right, but lots of animals, after they extinguish, right, they start exploring again.
Yes. In these experiments and in some real-world scenarios, you just don't have the option of going back to that earlier state. In those cases, you need to sort of update it. Any other questions? Beautiful. Sorry.
Yeah.
I tried to run the last experiment several times on my computer, but just I ran it like 4 times. Only 1 time the model-based method kind of like after the addition of the middle block that seems to learn.
I see. Yeah, I'm a bit maybe conservative in how many episodes I give this. So yeah, it's quite stochastic also, right? So it's based on the exploration policy. So in this case, the model-based algorithm, what's that? Yeah, so it's the case that the model-based algorithm, right, has to build up its transition matrix while it's trying to learn the task as well, right? So there are versions of this where it would more consistently learn if it, for example, had the transition matrix given. Yeah, so I would say set the episode number to be longer, like play with some of the hyperparameters. It's true that it also, yeah, I found this as well, that within the 500 that I give, sometimes none of them can solve it. Sometimes the model-based one solves it. But the other, within this 500 time step scale, it's never the case that these other algorithms will solve it. But it is the case that the value iteration one will.
Got it. Yeah, thank you.
Does your model-based system actually contain both the entire transition from both, or is it only seeing the transitions when it's trying to get to the goal? I mean, is it doing, say, is it starting with a random exploration of everything? Is your model-based starting with the random exploration of everything to build the map, or is it actually just trying to update the model as it's building the, as it's trying to get to the goal?
Yeah, so this one's trying to do both at once, right? Which is
Yeah,
why you get
so-
this problem where it may not be actually building the optimal transition structure, and therefore it's not always learning the optimal Q values.
That's gonna make it really hard, because what it has to learn is it has to learn that it has to go the opposite way of what it was doing.
Yeah, so there's a number of potential ways that you could do this, right? You could, for example, allow all of the agents to explore first. Then you would find, right, that the SR agent and the value iteration one would be able to build up their kind of cognitive maps of the environment. But here I'm just showing like pure online, everyone learning everything at once. And in this case, the value iteration is able to relatively consistently solve this version. Yeah. Okay, I know we're we're very short on time.
I mean, it's a box.
Yeah.
You can take like 5 to 10 to wrap up.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I would invite people, I guess, to definitely try playing with the parameters, see what works and what doesn't. I mean, I think these models have a number of different parameters, and they kind of like govern the learning dynamics. Here, at least, we can kind of like see what some of the Q functions that are being learned here after the roadblock is introduced. And we can see kind of like a bit what we'd expect, which is that the TDQ and the TDSR aren't really able to update for the fact that they, for example, realize that like there's no more value here, but they don't understand that like going up here is how to get the actual value. Whereas the DynaQ is starting to get it, right? So we'd expect that a Dyna algorithm, like Dyna SR, for example, would eventually get it, whereas the model-based one, when it is able to explore in such a way as to learn the right transition dynamics, is then able to use that to compute the optimal Q function. Great, yeah, and so we have some of the bonus questions, right? What do you expect the DynaSR algorithm to do? You're welcome to play with that yourself and instantiate it. And then for step 7, we have a whole bunch of kind of next steps to explore. I've only walked through a small kind of subset of the features of the NeuroNav toolkit. If you're interested in, for example, the observation space types or some of the other algorithms, you can either look at this other tutorial we have, which is a usage tutorial. It doesn't necessarily teach anything about the algorithms, but it might be more useful for understanding all the features of the API. As I showed at the beginning, we have a bunch of different notebooks that contain partial replications of various studies that might be of interest. At multiple points, Ida was talking about her 2017 study looking at human behavior and reevaluation contexts. We have replications of those results in 2 sets of notebooks that are linkable here. We have some results from the Stockenfeld et al. Nature paper showing that the successor representations can learn place-like representations, and that the eigendecomposition of this representation can look like grid-like fields, and that these representations deform in the way you'd expect around obstacles. So replications of those kind of results are available in this notebook. I also mentioned there are a number of other algorithms that are implemented in NeuroNav that I don't introduce here. You're invited, of course, to play with those if you're interested as well. And yeah, here, if you want any of the references to the things referenced in the tutorial, you can look here. Yeah. Great. So we don't have any time to make your own experiment, but I invite everyone to do that on their own. Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for coming here, for listening to the tutorial. Hopefully, it's been interesting to you. If you're doing research in the RL field, maybe NeuroNav might be useful to you in some kind of way. You might be able to add your task to it, or you may be able to have some behavioral data that you'd like to compare with what these simulated agents might do in a certain kind of task. If people would like to take the time to fill out the post-tutorial survey, that would be very helpful just to understand what features you might like to see if you're doing your own work. If you think, if NeuroNav makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't. If you're like, oh, it makes sense to me if only it had this one thing, maybe we can implement that. Yeah, if you'd want to contact me personally, here's my email. And lastly, yeah, people are welcome to pull that up. I'll just give that a moment. Yes.
And this is an open source project, what would your main requests of the community be? Like, what types of additions or contributions or use cases would you find most valuable?
Yeah, I would say I would turn it around, and I want to know what people want to do. I mean, my intention for this, right, is that like I'm going to be using it for some of my own work, right? So like I greedily am implementing things that make sense to me. But my intention also is to have it be as general purpose enough so that it can be useful for other people. I think one of the interesting things that I would ask of other people, I guess, is like the replications, I think, is most interesting to me. I feel like that's the best way to kind of stress test the library, is that if there are canonical studies that seem like they should fit into this framework and they do, then that's great. I would love to like have a replication of that as one of the notebooks. And if they don't, then that's even better, because it means that there's something we can change and improve about the library that makes it more generally useful for people.
I would also just add, one of our most important motivations was, if somebody wants to do a study and propose a new agent for navigation, we want there to be like a battery of different kinds of mazes and what kind of results, for instance, humans or rodents might show with the references in the repo. So you just pick your agent and you just throw it in there and compare it against all these other models that have existed from different papers, and on all of those tasks to compare that, the performance of your own model. So that's one thing that we would like to do. So if anybody would like to participate in producing domain-specific repos from your field where you think there is a battery of findings and mazes or tasks that are important, we would love it. Like, just add some folders for particular versions. The second thing is, if you think your experiment should be in some of the folders we already have, you've done something, for instance, David has done a lot of studies, or he knows some other people, we can say, okay, these are some mazes you need to add, and you need to add references so people can replicate, at least on the simulations, some classic studies that have happened. And maybe in this way, we can also include studies that were even older, some mazes, but they were never modeled. So our general goal would be, if anybody is interested in taking charge of producing or complementing or collaborating with us in order to complete some repos as a battery of quintessential tasks that any navigation model needs to do, as a battery of quintessential tasks any kind of decision-making model, or any kind of like another one that, whatever it is that is your choice, some memory models, etc. That's one thing. And the other thing is, if you think your task could benefit others if they had that structure, and obviously you would get cited if people get excited and use your task and compare and find something, just add it to the repo. And if you'd like to add something to the repo, we can talk about how best to serve the community so everybody can put it there. We are also definitely open to put it somewhere that's not under our name, but it's kind of like for everyone. And we definitely don't want to make it under Microsoft or any corporation. It's always going to be kind of open source. And any other suggestions you have or you think there would be, please write us. As Arthur was saying, one of our main goals here was to get feedback. Did I see a hand, or? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so right now it's only Markov tasks, and it's these two class structures. But of course, I'm very open to extending things. But I think one of the near-term things we want to add is continuous control style spaces. But I think, yeah, various forms of semi-Markov or POMDPs, like other formulations, are of interest as well.
Also, POMDPs, as well as some neural results. We have the success representation stuff, but it would be great to add other findings in the neural field.
Yeah, and so at the end of the repo, we have like a contributing policy, which is pretty general, and I think it's what Ida more or less just covered. Yeah, and then also we have a paper that if you end up using the library, we invite you to cite. Yeah, and so I would say I've held you all as a captive audience long enough. I'd love to one-on-one go over like code in the repo or anything, any questions that you might have in particular afterwards. Yeah, thank you so much.